In the last two videos, we looked at Milgram's original electric shock experiment. After running that first study at Yale University, Milgram wanted to know something deeper. Was obedience really about people's personalities, or was it mainly about the situation they were placed in? To find out, he carried out a series of follow-up studies, each changing one feature or variable of the environment. These are known as situational variables, and the three main ones were proximity, location, and uniform. So what are situational variables? Situational variables are features of the environment that influence how likely we are to obey. They aren't about who we are as individuals. They're about where the order is given, how close people are to each other, and how legitimate the authority figure appears. Milgram changed these one at a time to see how obedience would rise or fall. Proximity. In the original study, the teacher and learner were in separate rooms, and obedience reached 65%. When Milgram placed them together, obedience dropped to 40%. And when the teacher had to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate, obedience fell to 30%. When the experimenter phoned in the orders, obedience collapsed to about 20%, and some participants even just pretended to give shocks. This shows how psychological distance works. The closer the victim, or the further away the authority figure, the harder it is to obey. Location. Milgram then moved the study from prestigious Yale University to a rundown office building in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Obedience then fell to 47.5%. A less formal, less trustworthy setting reduced the perceived legitimacy of the authority figure. Uniform. In the baseline study, the experimenter wore a gray lab coat. In one variation, he was replaced by a casually dressed Confederate. Obedience then dropped to 20%. So uniforms signal authority, and when those signals disappear, obedience falls sharply. Let's look at a quick summary of Milgram's variations then. The baseline one at Yale, 65%. The rundown office location, 47.5%. Same room proximity, 40%. Touch proximity, 30%. Telephone orders, 20.5%. And no uniform, 20%. Across all variations, one pattern stands out. The less direct or legitimate the authority, the lower the obedience. Let's look at some support for Milgram's experiments. Milgram's findings didn't stand alone. In 1974, Leonard Bickman ran a field experiment in New York City to see how uniforms influenced obedience in everyday life. Male Confederates variously wore a security guard uniform. This had a strong authority signal, a jacket and tie, and a milkman's uniform. Of course, that's a uniform with no real authority. Dressed in these various ways, they asked strangers to do small tasks, like picking up litter or putting a coin into somebody else's parking meter, and the results were very clear. The highest obedience was obtained by the security guard. A moderate amount of obedience, the man in civilian clothes, that is, wearing a jacket and tie. The lowest obedience was to the milkman. This real-world evidence strongly supports Milgram's claim that visible signs of authority, like uniforms or wearing a jacket and tie, increase obedience. Cross-cultural replications. Milgram's findings have also been reproduced in other countries. For example, Meeus and Raaijmakers in 1986 in the Netherlands. Participants had to give stressful interview questions to a job applicant. 90% obeyed when ordered to continue, but obedience dropped sharply when the authority figure left the room. This shows the same pattern as Milgram. Proximity and legitimacy matter. But a caution. Smith and Bond reviewed obedience studies from 1968 to 1985 and found that most so-called cross-cultural replications were actually conducted in Western countries like Spain and Australia, places that share cultural similarities with the US. So we have good evidence across some cultures, but we shouldn't assume obedience works exactly the same way everywhere. Now, a major limitation was low internal validity. Critics such as Orne and Holland argued that many of Milgram's participants didn't fully believe the shocks were real. If they thought the setup was fake, their behavior might reflect demand characteristics, which of course is acting how they thought they were supposed to, rather than genuine obedience. If so, Milgram may not have been measuring real obedience, and that weakens the study's internal validity. And then there was the possibility that the situation was overemphasized. Milgram showed that situational pressures such as proximity, location, and uniform can have a powerful influence on behavior. As we've said, this helps explain why ordinary people might obey harmful orders. But there is a risk here. If we say behavior is only about the situation, we might accidentally downplay personal responsibility. Applied to events like the Holocaust, this could make it sound as if perpetrators were just following orders, like Adolf Eichmann claimed in his trial. Milgram never intended that interpretation, but it's an important ethical reminder. Situations matter, but individuals still make choices. Let's do a quick recap. Strengths. There's strong research support, such as Bickman's field study for Milgram's experiment. It's also been replicated in other countries, such as Meeus and Raaijmakers. And there are clear, consistent patterns across all variations. Weaknesses. Many participants may not have believed the shocks were real. Cross-cultural evidence is limited and mostly Western, and focusing too much on the situation may overlook personal responsibility. So, to the overall conclusion, Milgram's research on situational variables remains some of the strongest evidence we have for how context shapes obedience. Across all the studies, the same pattern emerges. We are more likely to obey when authority seems legitimate, close, and backed by symbols like uniforms. And when those situational cues weaken, obedience drops sharply. But while situations are powerful, individual responsibility still matters. Understanding both sides gives us a fuller picture of why people obey and why they sometimes refuse.